So last class we introduced the theory known as utilitarianism, and what utilitarianism adheres to is called the principle of utility. And what the principle of utility says is that actions are right insofar as they tend to promote aggregate happiness, and wrong insofar as they tend to promote aggregate pain. This is somewhat of a complicated way of saying something that I tried to argue last class is fairly familiar to us, which is just that actions are right which produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The theory of utilitarianism, as I showed, it is employed in a lot of ways that we commonly think about making decisions, about what decision would be right or what decision would be wrong. Some of the basic ideas behind utilitarianism are simply that our actions have consequences and those matter, and that we should strive to produce the most happiness in the world. How could an action that produces more pain be the right course of action, you might ask? And we went over several examples in which we saw the utilitarian reasoning was appealed to. For instance, examples of wartime decisions, or you might recall the example I gave of getting lied to when I tried to order my McFlurry at McDonald's. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at a little more precision that is introduced when utilitarianism is talked about as an ethical theory. As I said last class, the theory is in a way just built up off of kind of common sense ideas, but what the utilitarians wanted to do was to refine these common sense ideas to make them more precise, to make them more scientific. And so they introduced a lot of criteria that we need to employ when we go about making decisions. What they envisioned, in fact, was that the principle of utility could be used as a kind of decision procedure. And basically what that means is that when you're trying to make a decision about something, what the principle of utility is supposed to provide is a way to help us and assist us make that decision. But as it's stated, do the action which produces the most amount of happiness, avoid actions which produce more pain, it doesn't give a whole lot of practical guidance. And so as I was suggesting, what the utilitarians did is they offered a very specific set of guidelines that we should adhere to when we're trying to make our decisions about right actions or wrong actions. Now, the ones that were introduced are very complex. In fact, I think even Bentham, who was an early pioneer, he offered 7 different criteria that you need to adhere to when you're trying to make a decision. Now, I'm not going to go over all of these. Instead, what I'm going to do is just highlight a couple of important criteria or guidelines that we're supposed to use whenever we're trying to make a decision. And the very first one is that we must consider aggregate consequences of our actions. And this is actually embedded within the principle of utility itself. And some of you may have seen that word aggregate appear and you weren't exactly sure what it meant. But when we're talking about aggregate consequences, basically what we're talking about are those consequences that affect all of us. And whenever you're making a decision, you have to think about the big picture. In fact, this is going to be a common refrain that you hear when we talk about the theory of utilitarianism, is that you have to consider the big picture. What would a utilitarian say? What's the big picture here? And so think about, for instance, any kind of decision you might make. There are going to be a myriad of different people affected by that decision. So for instance, suppose I decide to upgrade my cell phone. You know, I've had my contract for a while and it's gotten to the point where I get a notification that I can upgrade my cell phone. Now, who is affected by that decision when I choose to upgrade my phone? Well, obviously I am, but there are going to be more people who are affected by it. For instance, the person who sells it to me at the store, they're going to be affected. The manufacturer, they're going to be affected. The person who ships the cell phone from the factory to the store, they're going to be affected. The people who make the cell phone, they're going to be affected. The people who make the parts for the cell phone, they're going to be affected. People who are on my network that I talk with are going to be affected. I mean, the reality is even a simple decision like choosing to upgrade one's cell phone, it's going to affect a host of different people. And what the utilitarian says is all people who are affected by a decision, they have to be taken into our utilitarian calculation. So when we're talking about aggregate consequences, what I'm referring to here are not just the consequences that affect me and maybe just those immediately connected with me, but everyone involved, the aggregate, who is going to be affected by any decision I'm going to make. Number two is, and this one's going to require a bit more explanation, is that the utilitarian said it's not just enough to consider the sheer number of people affected, but when you're making a decision, you have to consider the intensities of the pains and pleasures. And this is something I think that is pretty obvious, is that some things hurt a lot more than other things, and some things feel a lot better than other things. You know, if you just scratch your finger, well, that doesn't hurt as much as if you were to break your arm. Getting a drink of water tastes really good, but maybe, I don't know, a fine glass of wine tastes even better. Depends on how thirsty you are, I guess. Maybe in some contexts, water would actually be more intense kind of pleasure. But I think it's very obvious that some pleasures are more intense than others and some pains more intense than others. And when we're making a decision, it's not simply enough, when we're trying to figure out the right thing to do, it's not simply enough just to consider the sheer number of people affected, but we have to consider how much it affects the people involved. So here's an example. Have you ever decided you're going to go out to eat dinner, maybe like you and a couple of friends? Let's say you and 3 friends are going to go eat. And 3 of you, well, let's say you guys are having a hard time deciding. And so one person says, yeah, how about Applebee's? That's easy. It's nearby. And then 2 other people are like, yeah, I could go for Applebee's. But then one person just says, no, I hate Applebee's. Screw that place. I'll never go back there again. Well, in this case, you have 3 people who are agreed on going to Applebee's and 1 person who is dead set against it. And what do you do in this situation? Well, you might just leave them at home, but more times than not, what you do is you say, okay, we'll go somewhere else. Now, why is that? Notice it was 3 people versus 1, but you ended up doing what the 1 person wanted. Why? Because of how much pain it was going to bring them to go to Applebee's. And we regularly make decisions in just this way, is that we consider not just the number of people affected, but how much sheer pleasure or sheer pain it's going to bring them. And there might be cases that arise when maybe, 1 or 2 people might be seriously harmed, but then 10 other people might really get what they want. And in that case, you might decide to favor what the 2 people want over the 10. And what's interesting about this is that the utilitarians actually wanted to break this down, and they thought they could provide a scale by which we could measure pain and pleasure. And then we could calculate for any action precisely what should be done. And that might seem kind of silly in a way, but I want to give you an example to help illustrate how this was supposed to work out. So suppose you were deliberating between 2 actions, and I don't have creative names for them, so I just call them action X and action Y. And let's suppose you can only perform one of these actions. And action X makes 10 people moderately happy, whereas action Y makes 7 people extremely happy. Now, if you're trying to produce the most happiness in the world, which action should you perform, X or Y? The reality is you can't answer it just from looking at what I've told you here. You have insufficient information. And so this is why the utilitarians, what they wanted to do is break down and provide a unit of measure for happiness and for pain. And actually they had a name for this. It was called a hedon, H-E-D-O-N, was 1 unit of happiness. And this might sound really, really silly. It's like, wait, how can you measure happiness? How can you say, well, this brings me 10 hedons of pleasure and this brings me 5 hedons of pleasure? That sounds really silly. But in a way, it's actually something that's somewhat familiar to you. And you've probably seen a scale like this appear in your doctor's office. You'll go and your doctor will say, well, how much happiness does this bring you? Or let's say you've broken your arm or something. And they'll say, well, how much pain is this on the scale of pain? Or how much happiness does something bring you? And we can measure it. And as I was saying a second ago, we do recognize that some pleasures are more intense than others, and some pains are more intense than others. And we can derive some kind of scale here. Now, could we get really, really refined with this? Could I say, well, this brings me 3.567 units of happiness or pain? No, we couldn't get that refined, but we can weigh and measure it along some kind of continuum and scale. And so even though maybe the utilitarians were, a bit overly ambitious and maybe a bit naive in certain ways, I think that some sense can be made of their general project, which was just to provide some kind of consideration for the sheer amount of happiness and pain that would be provided with any given action. Now, with this being said, and we go back to my previous example, and we say action X makes 10 people moderately happy, well, where will we place moderate happiness on the scale? I mean, we could dispute this a little bit, but I'm going to place moderate happiness right here at 6. And we'll say moderate happiness is 6. And then, so 10 people are moderately happy, so action X produces 10 total units of happiness in the world. Now, action Y makes 7 people extremely happy. Well, where will we place extreme happiness? Well, we'll just go with 10, because that seems the most extreme. So action Y makes 7 people extremely happy. Extreme happiness is equal to 10. So action Y would produce 70 total units of happiness in the world. And so what we can see from this is that for the utilitarian, you should do action Y. Even though it benefits fewer total people, it produces more total happiness in the world. And that's ultimately what the utilitarian is promoting, is happiness and reducing pain, not just producing happy people versus reducing people who are in pain. Now, I know you might be wondering here, well, what about these 10 people who don't get what they want? And that's something that we would have to also factor in. I mean, honestly, even something as simple as this would be much more complicated than what I've represented here. But hopefully this is enough to demonstrate to you what the utilitarian is driving at. When we consider the intensities of pleasures and pains, it's not sufficient for the utilitarian just to count up the number of people an action would benefit and then weigh that against the sheer number of people who it would harm. We have to consider, well, how much would it benefit them versus how much would it harm this other group? All right, so that's number 2. Number 3, for the utilitarian, we also have to consider short and long-term consequences of our actions. And for the utilitarian, at the end of the day, what you're trying to do, and like I said a second ago, you got to consider the big picture, is you're trying to provide the most amount of happiness, not just in the here and now, but also 5, 10, 20 years, 50 years down the road. You're trying to produce the total amount of happiness and reduce overall pain. And so for the utilitarian, you can't just simply perform an action which would maybe lead to a lot of happiness now if in the long run it's going to produce more total pain. And I want to give you an example or a couple of examples of something like this. So consider, for instance, cigarette smoking. I know a lot of people who smoke. My father smoked for a long period of time. Cigarette smoking, it produces a certain amount of pleasure each time you do it. But if you look at cigarette smoking over the long haul, it is a very, very irrational thing to do. Why do I say that? Well, because after years and years of smoking, it will almost inevitably catch up with you. Now, I know that there are some statistical aberrations of like 1 in a million. Actually, it's going to be more than or less than that. It's probably 1 in 100 million of people who don't develop cancer or whatever. But for the vast majority of people, if you smoke, what's going to end up happening is it puts you at a higher risk for every type of harmful condition: heart disease, cancer, emphysema, high blood pressure, stroke. You name it, cigarette smoke does all of that to you. And so what a utilitarian would say about cigarette smoking is just this, is, all right, well, let's look at all the little units of pleasure you get over the course of your life. It made you feel good, smoke. Maybe it made you look cool or something. You could look like James Dean. I don't know. But then you weigh that against all the harm that comes to you once cigarette smoking finally catches up with you. I don't know if you've ever watched anyone die of cancer. I have, and it's really, really heart-wrenching, and it's a lot of pain that's involved in that. And so what you have to do is you have to weigh and consider, okay, was all that pleasure that I experienced from smoking, was it worth it? Was it worth it for me to suffer for the last few years of my life in constant agony and pain, and then on top of that to have my life cut short? Because but for the cigarette smoking, you probably could live for another 10, 15, 20 years. And so you're missing out on all the pleasure life would have provided you for that additional 20 years. And so what the utilitarian would say about cigarette smoking is just that it's wrong. You shouldn't do it. Why? Because even if in the here and now it brings you a little bit of pleasure, in the long run it produces more total unhappiness. And so when you're thinking big picture, it's just not a terribly rational thing to do. Here's another example I want to provide for you. This is a story about a town in Pennsylvania named Centralia, Pennsylvania. And I doubt very many of you have ever even heard of Centralia, Pennsylvania, and there's a good reason for that. Centralia, Pennsylvania no longer exists. Centralia, Pennsylvania, it was a coal mining town that was been around for a long period of time. And then back in the 1960s, a coal fire started underneath the town. And you can see right here that the coal fire, these mines and shafts, they spread all under the town. And what eventually started happening is that the ground became unstable as these fires spread through the coal mine. And roads, as you can see right here, started to collapse. Sinkholes formed right here. And steam and smoke from these coal fires started coming out of the ground. As a result of this, houses started to sink into the ground. I believe actually the way it was discovered is one child actually fell through a hole and died. Houses just started to crumble. City streets started to break apart. And the town eventually had to just shut down. And I think to this day they have barricades that are there so that you can't even get near the town because it's just so dangerous to approach it. Not only just from falling in the ground, but from the hazardous smoke that's coming out of the ground. And scientists actually estimate that this fire will burn for another 250 years. There's just no way to put it out, given the fact that the coal burns so fast and so hot, and it spreads through so many little nooks and crannies. It's really impractical. There's no way to get to it. Now, this is a really tragic tale. And you might wonder, well, how in the world did these fires start? And the way these fires started is back in the 1950s, the city of Centralia didn't have a central site for people to dump their garbage. And so what had happened is basically just these kind of impromptu garbage sites had developed around the outskirts of the town, and people were just going and dumping their garbage in these random sites. And the town decided, it's like, look, this isn't healthy. We can't have hazardous materials just being dumped out in the woods. What we need is a central dump site. And so where it was decided to dump the garbage was this old abandoned coal mine. They said, hey, we'll just shove garbage in this coal mine. And it seemed like a really good idea. I mean, hey, we're going to clean up the city. We're going to get rid of all these hazardous wastes so they're not out and about and exposed so people can be injured by them in any sort of way. It's just much more sanitary. And we're going to put them in this coal mine. The coal mine's not doing anything anyway. It'll be out of sight, out of mind. Well, here's the problem. As a result of having all this decomposing garbage down there, it eventually caught fire. And as a result of the fire, that fire spread through the coal mines and ended up destroying the whole town. And so here's where the utilitarian would come in and say, hey, what you did was wrong. And it seems like the utilitarian is obviously right about this, because if a decision in the here and now does have some immediately good payoff, which this did. It got rid of these impromptu dump sites and it cleaned up the town. But even if it has this immediate kind of payoff, if in the long run it ends up destroying your entire town, well then clearly it was the wrong decision. And this is precisely what the utilitarian is telling us we have to consider. Think about the long term. Think about the big picture. Don't just consider the here and now. Consider how are your actions what consequences are they going to lead to in the future? Even if they produce good results now, if they destroy your whole life in the future, then clearly it was the wrong course of action. So those are three things that the utilitarian asks us to consider. I want to mention one final one, and I find this one to be one of the more distinctive things about the utilitarian point of view. And finally, what the utilitarian says is that everyone's happiness must be given equal consideration. And basically what this means is that for the utilitarian, all they're concerned about is producing the total amount of happiness in the world. And they are not concerned about your race, your gender, your sexual orientation. For the utilitarian, what ultimately matters is Can you experience happiness and can you experience pain? And if you can, then you have to be given equal consideration. This is what is known as the impartiality requirement. The utilitarian, their point of view is not prejudiced or biased against any particular group. Everybody is counted on the same playing field. And this is true also regardless of your nationality. For the utilitarian, they don't care if you're American or Chinese or Mexican or you're from Guatemala. None of that is important from a moral point of view. All that matters is, can you experience happiness and can you experience pain? And what is interesting about their point of view is, suppose that we were considering doing a particular action that would benefit, let's say 50 million Americans, but it would also, in the process, harm 300 million Chinese people. Well, then the utilitarian would say, you can't do that. And what you can't say is, well, yeah, but it's American, so they're more important. The utilitarian's going to nod their head no and say, no, that's not the proper way to think about it. What is most important is maximizing happiness and minimizing pain. And it doesn't matter how that utility, or utility or happiness is distributed. If an action would, let's say harm 1 million Americans but benefit 1 billion Chinese, then the utilitarian would say that's the preferred course of action. You can't be biased against other people simply because they happen to be of your nationality or they happen not to be in your nationality. Everybody gets counted equally. No one gets counted for more than one. I want to be very clear about what this impartiality requirement demands of us, because it's not saying that everybody gets what they want. That's just not possible. You cannot satisfy everybody's desires. You can't make everybody happy. What it's saying is just this, is that before a decision is reached about what action one should perform, you have to give everybody equal consideration. And so what this is trying to guard against is preferencing or being biased in favor of one person or one group over another group up front. A lot of times when we make decisions, our country, for instance, we think about, well, how is this going to benefit America? And we don't care who it hurts abroad. And what the utilitarian says is that's just wrong. You can't do that. Why? Because even people who are of a different country, they can experience happiness and they can experience pain. And they're agents and beings who are worthy of your moral consideration. And it's just arbitrary. It's not a good moral reason to say, yeah, but they're not American, so they're worthless. That just doesn't make good sense for the utilitarian. Everybody has to be given equal consideration. Now, at the end of the day, once we've tallied up all the amount of happiness that an action is going to produce, if it would benefit and produce more total happiness to help Americans and that harm people in, let's say, China, well, then we should do it if it's going to produce the most total happiness. On the other hand, if it would produce more total happiness to help people in China, even if it harmed people in the United States, well, then the utilitarian would say that we should do that. Because it doesn't matter how the happiness is distributed, as long as the action produces more total happiness, then it's the right course of action. So based on what we've seen, it appears that the theory of utilitarianism, it's got some strong points in its favor. One of the big things I think that really favors this view is the fact that it seems to square with many of our real-world ways of thinking about things. At the same time, you might have heard the theory presented thus far and think, well, this doesn't exactly and precisely line up with every single belief that you're going to have. And it's not going to. No ethical theory is going to square 100% with your pre-established and pre-existing moral beliefs. It's just not possible. Why? Because people believe all kinds of different things about morality. We saw this before when I asked you to do the discussion board where you listed the things that you thought were immoral. And what you saw is that there was disagreement about many things in the class. Some people think capital punishment is immoral and other people don't. Some people think abortion is immoral and other people don't. Some people think homosexuality is immoral and other people don't. So it would just be impossible to construct a theory that said that homosexuality or capital punishment is both immoral and not immoral. That just doesn't make any sense. So chances are that an ethical theory, once we've derived a good one, it is going to ask us to revise certain beliefs that we do have about morality. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Uh, all we want out of our ethical theory is that it can make sense of those shared core moral beliefs. And if you have a good theory that can explain those, well, if it asks you to revise some of your other beliefs, as long as they're not major revisions, as long as it's not asking you to revise some of these shared core moral beliefs, or too many of them, I should say, then the theory would probably be a good one. Like I said, some revision at the periphery is probably okay. A lot of revision at the core of what we all think is right, chances are the theory is going to be in serious trouble. So what I want to do at this point is I want to look at the way the utilitarian asks us to reason about a couple of different things. And like I said, it is going to require some revision of our beliefs. But what I want to ask you is this revision that it requires, is it too demanding? Is it too much? Or are the utilitarian revisions that we see, are they things that are acceptable? Sometimes, in fact, what I've discovered is that certain theories will ask us to revise our moral beliefs, and then I think, yeah, I probably should revise my belief. I thought that I was maybe doing something wrong, or I had a false belief to begin with, or I suspected my belief was false, and this theory now is giving me a good reason to explain why I had suspicions about this particular belief. So I want to begin by looking at what is, I'm sure, an issue that is near and dear to some of your hearts, which is the legalization of marijuana, and whether or not marijuana should be legalized. Now, there are a wide variety of arguments as to why it should or it shouldn't be legalized, but what I want to do is focus in on what a utilitarian would say about this. And in the reading, James Rachel's, he said that the utilitarian would be in favor of legalizing marijuana. Now, I think that Rachel's claim there is a bit premature. I don't think it's as cut and dry as he indicates that it is. I think it's actually a much, much more complicated matter as to whether or not a utilitarian would think marijuana should be legalized. And really and truly, to answer this question, what a utilitarian would say is that we have to do a kind of cost-benefit analysis. What we have to do is we have to ask, well, what would be the benefits of legalizing marijuana versus what would be the harms? And what we'd have to decide is would it produce more total happiness to legalize it, or would it produce more total harms if it were legalized? So what I want to do is I want you to stop and think, what are some potential harms of legalizing marijuana? Now, I'm no expert on this matter, and so some of the things I say here, some of you I'm sure are going to roll your eyes at because you probably know a lot more about marijuana, and you've probably talked about this, whether or not it should be legalized with some of your friends. But I'm just going to list some potential harms here. And like I said, they're potential. These things are not necessarily well established that these harms would come about, but they're at least things that people discuss, and you'd have to consider these things if you were given serious thought to legalizing marijuana. Well, one potential harm of legalizing marijuana is that if you did, it would get into the hands of young people more. Now, I know some of you probably think, well, young people already get their hands on marijuana, but the reality is if it were legalized, it would be a lot more accessible and a lot easier for them to get. If you could just buy marijuana at any pharmacy, or you could buy marijuana, you could get it like people get tobacco or at vape shops, or you could just buy, like you buy cigarettes, it would just be around a lot more. There'd be much more of it getting used. In fact, the reality is, and some people want to deny this, but if marijuana were legalized, use would go up. I mean, that's just a reality. Use would go up. More people would use it if it were legalized. And to give some example or some parallel with this, we can compare marijuana with prohibition. And when prohibition was established in the United States, prohibition against alcohol, consumption of alcohol, it went down. A lot of people criticize prohibition and they say that it didn't work. Kind of the dirty little secret about prohibition is that it actually did work. That prohibition did drive alcohol use down. And it makes sense that it would if you stop and reflect on it, because it made it way more difficult to get alcohol. The only way you could get it was purchasing it illegally. And the problem with doing that is you ran a big legal consequence. You ran a huge risk if you were to buy it from somebody. You could go to jail, you could be fined. And for many people, the risk just wasn't worth it. And the same thing is probably true of marijuana. For many people, they don't want to run the risk of going to jail or spending 5 years in jail for simple possession. And so it's just, for them, makes much more sense not to use it. However, if it were legal, just like what happened with Prohibition, once Prohibition was lifted, alcohol use went up as a result. And I can imagine, it seems very, very reasonable that if marijuana were legal, use would go up. We've seen it before. When something becomes legal, use goes up. And if use goes up, that means the substance is more readily available and it gets in the hands of young people. And this is not a good thing. We don't want it getting in the hands of young people, because what we've seen is that and this is true, that if you use marijuana at an early age, it will stunt brain development. And this is probably true of any drug, I would imagine. If, for instance, you have 5-year-olds drinking alcohol or 10-year-olds drinking alcohol, that's not going to be good for their brain development. Or smoking cigarettes. And I think back to my own childhood. My dad was a smoker, and I remember as a child, it wasn't difficult at all for me to get his cigarettes if I wanted them. And so I would steal them occasionally, or maybe he'd flick one out in the yard and then walk back in the house, and then I'd go pick it up and I'd smoke it, thinking I was cool. And you can imagine something very, very similar would happen with children when it came to marijuana use. If it were legalized, it would be much more prevalent, much more available. It would get in the hands of young people, and that would harm them. Now, I don't know if this next one is true. I think it's been shown that it's not true, but I really don't know. But I do hear this, is that marijuana is a gateway drug. And basically what that means is that people start off who want to get high using marijuana, and then as a result of that, they eventually grow accustomed to that high, and so they have to use harder and harder and harder drugs in order to repeat that high. Now, like I said, I'm not sure if this is actually true. I've seen studies showing both sides, saying that it is and that it isn't, but it's at least something that's a potential harm. If marijuana use it does rise as a result of legalizing it, and it is a gateway drug, then we run the risk, if we legalize it, of people using harder and harder drugs in order to repeat the high. Another potential harm is that if marijuana use were legalized and consumption did go up, then we'd have increased automotive accidents as a result. You'd have more and more people using, so you'd have more and more people high, and so you'd have more and more automotive accidents, presumably because people will be driving while they're high. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, yeah, but you already have people driving around who are drunk. And that's true. And in fact, you did have more drunk drivers as a result of Prohibition being lifted. So chances are you'd have more people high who are driving also. And the fact that you already have people who are drunk driving, that doesn't in any way show that it would make good sense to have more people on the road who are incapacitated as a result of their marijuana use. If anything, you'd say, well, since we already have a lot of drunk people driving, we don't need to exacerbate the problem by having people who are high and driving. So here is another potential problem that could come about from legalizing marijuana. And these aren't the only ones, but these are just ones that I've thought of and that come to my mind as to what is a possible harm. Now let's look at the potential benefits of legalizing marijuana. And one, and this probably is the most obvious, is the pleasure from using the drug. Because like the utilitarian says, happiness is good, and if using a drug makes you feel good, well, that's some kind of happiness, and that has to be taken into account. Another potential benefit is that marijuana has been shown to have certain medical benefits. For instance, people who are going through chemotherapy, and it's been shown that by using marijuana, it can help them regain their appetite. I've also seen that it's good for people with glaucoma. And there are other kinds of medical benefits that for some people, again, it's a pain suppressant. If they're going through chemotherapy or radiation, or they're dealing with cancer, it can help with that also. And I'm not sure exactly what the other medical benefits are. The truth is there's not really good science on that right now because of the way that marijuana has been classified. I think it's what's called a Schedule 1 drug. And as a result of that classification, it's actually been illegal for scientists to do prolonged studies on marijuana use to test to see what benefits it could have medically speaking. Anecdotally, there are a lot of benefits that people say they get, but from a pure scientific study, there really hasn't been the research necessary to determine this. But medical benefits are one. Another possible benefit of legalizing marijuana is that it would free up a lot of our resources that are spent on capturing and prosecuting people who smuggle or use marijuana. As it stands, we spend billions of dollars trying to stop people from smuggling marijuana into the country. We spend billions of dollars as a nation prosecuting, locking people away, those who use and those who distribute marijuana. And it wouldn't, if we legalized it, it wouldn't eradicate the black market entirely. This is a misconception. There'd still be a black market for marijuana use. Here's something that's kind of surprising, but in Canada, there's actually a black market for maple syrup. Yes, I said maple syrup, the stuff you put on your pancakes. There's a black market for it. I saw a news story just a couple of years ago where I think several $100,000 of maple syrup had been stolen in Canada to be sold on the black market. Why? Because selling it on the black market is just cheaper. And so a lot of people wouldn't want to pay the price of expensive marijuana, and so they'd be willing to buy it on the street to get an inferior product but at a cheaper price. So you're always going to have a black market, and you're always going to have police to regulate that, just like we do with tobacco and alcohol. Nonetheless, we'd spend as a nation way less money on this if we legalized it. And so we could use these resources for other things. We could use these resources for, I don't know, free tuition for all community college students. Or how about this one? Pay raises for your college professors. That'd be a good use of money. We could use it for a lot of other things other than prosecuting and locking people away for using marijuana. We could also, tax marijuana. And so that would be another benefit. We could raise revenue. And in fact, the state of Colorado, where it's been legalized for recreational use, they're making money hand over fist right now by taxing marijuana. And so the federal government could do the exact same, or various states could do the same thing. So not only would it free up, would we spend less money prosecuting people for this or policing marijuana, we could actually make money as governments, as the government could, state and federal government. One final thing, and this is maybe something that some of you haven't thought of, but legalizing marijuana would actually help reduce border crime. Right now, as it stands, border cities that are just south of the border in Mexico, places like Juarez, Mexico, these places are basically war zones where innocent civilians, can't walk down the street without fear of being shot by some members of drug cartels. Because these cities are basically launching points for the cartels to smuggle their drugs into the country. And what they do is they fight for territory over in these cities. And so the innocent civilians there are just caught in the crossfires as all these wars are taking place. And this is something you may not have considered, because a lot of times when we think about drug policy in the United States, we think solely about, well, how is this going to affect Americans? And here's where the theory of utilitarianism maybe becomes a little different than the way you would have ordinarily thought about things. But what the theory of utilitarianism says is that when we're making a decision about whether or not we should legalize marijuana, we have to consider all of these things, we have to consider these things, but equally as important, we have to consider how our drug policy affects people in other countries. And suppose that legalizing marijuana, suppose that it created a little bit more harm for Americans. Suppose it lowered our overall happiness, let's say by 10 units. but it increased happiness in Mexico by 15 units. Well, then what the utilitarian would say is, even though it made Americans a little more unhappy, due to the fact that it reduced border crime and it increased the total happiness of people in Mexico more, then we should do it. At the end of the day, the utilitarian doesn't care about how happiness is distributed. And this goes back to what I was saying a moment ago about the impartiality requirement. It doesn't matter how happiness is distributed. As long as more total happiness in the world is produced, then that's the right course of action. And some of you might be thinking, yeah, well, we need to do what's best for America. And we do to a certain extent, but think about this for a second. If what is best for America really makes other people in the world worse off, is it really the right course of action? Is it not just being selfish to say, but that we should favor America over people in Mexico or over people in Guatemala or someplace else? Is that not being selfish? I mean, these people didn't choose where they were born. It was just completely an arbitrary thing that they were born on one side of an invisible line and you were born on the other side of this invisible line. And try to put yourself in their position where you can't walk out of your house without bullets whizzing by your head, all because people on some other side of an invisible line want drugs, and so the people in my country are doing their best to smuggle them across this invisible line into a neighboring country. It's not really fair, and it doesn't seem right. And what the utilitarian would say is that it's just completely arbitrary where you're born. That's not something you choose. That's something that's maybe not even really chosen for you. And so we have to give people in other countries equal consideration when we're making policy decisions about legalizing marijuana or any other policy decision for that matter. So once we've looked at all of this, what do you think a utilitarian would say? Should we legalize marijuana? Yes or no? And the truth is, the utilitarian is more than willing to acknowledge that either way we go, someone stands to lose. There are potential harms if we legalize it, and there are potential harms if it remains illegal. It's really impossible to say up front what the utilitarian would say. And the truth is it would take a lot more calculations and a lot more research than what we can do in our class. What's important, and what I want you to see about this, is that the only thing that matters for the utilitarian are the total net consequences that the action produces. If it produces more benefit to legalize marijuana, then we should legalize it. If it produces more harm to legalize it, then we should not legalize it. That's all that matters for the utilitarian. Unlike James Rachel's, I can't tell you exactly whether they would come down in favor of legalizing it or they would come down against it. My guess is they would come down in favor of it, but again, if the research, and this would take a lot more research than what we can do, and a lot more research, I think, than has been done. But if the research pointed in favor of legalizing it, if it said more good would come about from legalizing it, then that's what should be done. If the research came out and said no, it produced more harm to legalize it, then we shouldn't do it. And all that matters are the total consequences. And this is so important because I want to show you an important implication here. And this is distinct from the ways that we might ordinarily think about these kinds of things. Because one of the key arguments, and one of the more repeated arguments you hear people make about in favor of legalizing marijuana, is that it's an individual rights issue. A lot of times people say things like, well, it's my body, my right, and if I want to smoke marijuana, who's the government to tell me I can't? I should have a right to do with my body whatever I see fit. And what's important here is that the utilitarian doesn't give two whits about this argument. This argument right here, arguing that marijuana should be legal as a consequence of individual rights, that's not important for them at all. This argument right here is actually one, I don't know if you're familiar with the political party known as libertarians, but libertarians frequently make this argument. People like Ron Paul or Rand Paul, these people argue that all drugs, in fact, should be legal just as a function of your natural bodily rights. So someone like Ron Paul, who ran for president a couple cycles ago, He said that even heroin and crystal meth should be legal. Why? Because it's your body, your right. You should be able to do with your life as you see fit, just as long as it doesn't harm someone else. And so he thought even hard drugs should be legal. But for the utilitarian, this kind of argument, it means absolutely nothing to them. Remember, the utilitarian theory is a consequentialist theory, and all it's concerned about with are the net consequences of your actions. Do your actions produce more good results in the long run, or do they produce more bad results in the long run? And that's all they're worried about.